The locks were changed. That was the first thing Claire Bennett noticed when she pulled into the driveway of the house she had grown up in. The house where her father had taught her to ride a bike. The house where she had once believed nothing bad could ever truly reach her. Her key, the same key she had carried on her ring for over 20 years, slid into the front door and simply would not turn. She jiggled it, twisted it harder, pressed her shoulder against the wood out of pure disbelief, refusing to accept what her hands were already telling her. For a moment, she genuinely thought she had grabbed the wrong key by mistake. Then she looked up and saw a small black security camera mounted above the porch light. A camera that had not been there 3 days earlier when she'd last visited her mother. Its tiny red light blinking at her like an accusation. Someone had installed it. Someone had planned this. She knocked. She rang the bell until her thumb ached. She called out her mother's name again and again into the cold evening air, her voice cracking with a fear she had never felt before in her entire life. Finally, the door opened, not by her mother, but by her own brother, Ryan, standing in the doorway of their father's house, with his arms crossed and an expression so calm, so rehearsed, that it chilled her more than any scream could have. "You don't live here anymore, Claire," he said, as evenly as if he were commenting on the weather outside. "This is my house now." Claire felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had passed away only 4 months earlier, and in that short, brutal window of grief, something in her family had quietly rotted from the inside out without her ever noticing. She had been so consumed by loss, so busy trying to help her aging mother cope with an empty house and an empty side of the bed, that she hadn't seen the slow, deliberate way Ryan had been inserting himself into every conversation with the family lawyer, every visit to the bank, every decision that used to require the whole family's input and agreement. Now, standing frozen on the porch of the home where she had taken her first steps, celebrated every birthday of her childhood, and held her father's hand as he took his very last breath, she was being told, flatly and without hesitation, that she no longer belonged there. "Where is Mom?" Claire asked, her voice breaking apart in the middle of the sentence. Ryan's expression didn't shift even slightly. "She's resting. And for what it's worth, she agrees with me. This house needs one owner, not constant fighting." "I'm sorry, Claire, but it's time you accepted that Dad wanted things simple." Nothing about what was happening felt simple. Nothing about it felt like the father she had loved and buried only months earlier. If you're just joining this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next to Claire will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and how far people will go when money and desperation collide. This is Legacy Whisper, and today's story is one you will not forget. Claire drove away from her childhood home that evening with her hands shaking so violently she had to pull over twice on the side of the road just to breathe. She wasn't an emotional person by nature. She had spent 15 years working as a hospital administrator, a job that demanded calm, clear-headed decision-making under enormous pressure, the kind of steady thinking required when everyone around her was falling apart. But this was different. This wasn't a crisis at work. That ended when her shift did. This was her own family unraveling in real time right in front of her, and she had absolutely no idea how to stop it. She thought back to the last real conversation she'd had with her father, 6 months before he died, sitting beside his hospital bed while machines beeped steadily in the sterile quiet around them. He had reached out and taken her hand, his grip noticeably weaker than she remembered from her childhood, and said something she hadn't fully understood at the time. "Claire, whatever happens after I'm gone, don't panic. I've made sure you and your mother are taken care of. Ryan doesn't know everything, and that's exactly how I planned it." She had assumed, at the time, that he was simply offering comfort, the kind of vague reassurance dying parents often give their children. She never imagined those quiet words would one day become the single most important sentence anyone had ever spoken to her. Ryan had always been the golden child, growing up, the one who could seemingly do no wrong in their father's eyes. Or at least that was how it appeared on the surface to anyone looking in from the outside. He had gone into real estate straight out of college, flipping houses and chasing deals that always seemed to be one signature away from falling apart entirely. Their father had quietly bailed him out more than once over the years, without ever telling Claire the full extent of how deep the debts had actually gone. Claire, meanwhile, had built her career slowly and carefully, put herself through night school for her master's degree while working full-time during the day, and never once asked her parents for a single dollar of financial help. She had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that hard work and honesty were the exact values her father had raised both of them to believe in and live by. She hadn't accounted for the fact that desperation changes people in ways love alone cannot always predict. And Ryan, drowning quietly in debts from a failed development project, had become desperate in ways she never once saw coming until it was almost too late. The weeks that followed the confrontation on the porch were some of the darkest weeks of Claire's entire life. Her mother, Diane, stopped answering her phone calls altogether, which frightened Claire for more than anything Ryan had said to her that evening. Diane had always been a warm, endlessly talkative woman, the kind of mother who called just to hear her daughter's voice, who sent long rambling text messages full of exclamation points about her garden or her weekly book club meetings. This silence felt deeply unnatural, and Claire began to suspect that Ryan wasn't simply asking their mother to stay quiet. She feared, with a growing sense of dread, that he was actively controlling what their mother saw, heard, and believed about their entire family. When Claire finally managed to catch her mother alone at a local pharmacy one gray afternoon, Diane looked visibly thinner, paler, and strangely distant, as though she were speaking to her daughter from somewhere far away. "Ryan says you've been causing problems, dear," Diane murmured, refusing to meet Claire's eyes directly. "He says you're trying to take the house away from both of us. Is that even true, Claire?" Claire felt a heartbreaking mixture of grief and fury rise up in her chest all at once. Ryan wasn't just taking the house from her, he was rewriting reality itself, one careful lie at a time, and their grieving, vulnerable mother was believing every single word he told her. Claire began quietly gathering information. After that, terrified of what she might eventually find, but even more terrified of doing absolutely nothing while her family fell apart around her, she reached out to her father's longtime attorney, a soft-spoken man named Walter Higgins, who had handled the Bennett family's legal matters for over 20 careful years. When she asked him directly about her father's will, his hesitation on the phone told her something was deeply, seriously wrong before he had even said a single word. "Claire," he said carefully, choosing each word with visible caution, "I think it would be best if you came into the office in person. There are some things about your father's estate that I believe you truly need to see for yourself." That single sentence kept Claire awake for 3 consecutive nights, replaying every possible scenario in her mind, each new possibility somehow worse than the one before it. Had her father secretly changed his will near the end without ever telling her? Had Ryan manipulated him during his final, weakened days in the hospital? Or was there something else entirely happening? Something far more complicated than she had even considered. When Claire arrived at Walter's office, the air inside felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of tension that always precedes news no one truly wants to deliver out loud. Walter slid a folder slowly across the desk toward her, his eyes filled with something caught between deep sympathy and genuine concern. Inside was a copy of a document Claire had never seen before in her life. A deed transfer dated just 3 weeks before her father's death, transferring full and complete ownership of the family home to Ryan Bennett alone. Her father's signature was on it. Her mother's signature was there too, listed as a witness. Claire's stomach dropped violently as she stared down at the page, her mind racing desperately to make sense of what she was actually looking at. "This can't be right," she whispered, her hands trembling around the paper. "My father would never do this without telling me first. He promised me the house would stay in the family, that it would be shared between us, that Mom would always have a place there, no matter what happened to any of us." Walter leaned forward slowly, his voice dropping into something quiet, graver, and far more serious than before. "Claire, I need you to look very closely at the date printed on this document, and then I need you to think carefully about exactly where your father actually was on that specific day." It took Claire less than 30 seconds to realize that the date on the deed transfer corresponded Exactly with the day her father had been rushed into emergency surgery, a fact she remembered with sharp, painful clarity because she had been the one sitting in that hospital waiting room for 11 agonizing hours, holding her mother's hand tightly, praying quietly that he would survive through the night. Her father could not possibly have signed anything that day. He had been unconscious under anesthesia, fighting for his life on an operating table nearly 40 miles away from the address printed on that transfer document. Someone had forged his signature in cold blood, and the only two people who had consistent access to both of her parents, who had been quietly managing their affairs throughout that exact period, who possessed both motive and opportunity in equal, terrifying measure, were sitting in her mind now, like the jaws of a slowly closing trap. Ryan, and possibly, though she desperately hoped otherwise, with everything in her own mother, Walter gently explained that fraudulent deed transfers, while devastating to the families involved, were unfortunately not uncommon in situations involving aging or ill parents, especially when large, paid-off assets like a family home were suddenly at stake. He strongly advised Claire to proceed carefully, to gather solid evidence before confronting anyone directly, because reckless accusations without proof could permanently destroy what little remained of her already fractured family, and worse, could tip Ryan off before she had anything concrete enough to bring to the authorities. Claire left his office that day feeling as though she were standing at the very edge of a cliff she hadn't even known existed until that morning. Her brother, the boy she had shared a bedroom wall with for 18 years, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding when their father had been too sick to do it himself, had apparently orchestrated a fraud so calculated and cold that it made her physically ill just to think about it. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing, something Walter mentioned almost as a passing afterthought, something that would eventually change absolutely everything. Your father set up something else a long time ago, Claire, something completely separate from the house, back when you and Ryan were both still teenagers. I don't know all the specific details myself. He handled it privately through a different bank entirely, one your family didn't normally use. If I were you, I'd start looking there first. That night, Claire sat alone at her kitchen table long after her husband and daughter had already gone to bed, turning her father's old, cracked leather address book over and over in her hands, searching desperately for any small clue about a bank he might have used decades earlier in his life. She found nothing conclusive at first, only a faded, yellowed business card tucked into the back pages for a place called Ashford Trust Bank, a name she barely recognized at all, a small regional institution that had since been quietly absorbed by a much larger financial company. She almost dismissed it entirely as an irrelevant relic from another era of her father's life. She had no idea that 2 days later, her phone would ring with a single call that would turn her entire world upside down. In ways both terrifying and unimaginably hopeful, the call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while Claire was reviewing patient intake reports at work, a day that had started out like any other ordinary day of her life. The number on her screen was unfamiliar, a local area code she didn't immediately recognize, and she nearly let it go straight to voicemail before something deep inside her told her to answer it anyway. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Patricia Reyes, a senior trust officer with Meridian Financial Group, the larger company that had acquired Ashford Trust Bank many years earlier. Mrs. Bennett Hayes, Patricia said, using Claire's married name with a formality that made Claire's pulse quicken instantly. I'm calling regarding a trust account established by your late father, Thomas Bennett, back in 1998. Under the specific terms of the trust, you were supposed to be notified directly upon his passing, but there was an administrative delay in processing the necessary paperwork. I sincerely apologize for the wait, Mrs. Bennett Hayes. There are some important matters we need to discuss with you directly, in person, as soon as you're able to come in. Claire sat completely frozen at her desk, her co-workers moving around her in a distant blur, as Patricia explained, in careful and deliberate tones, that Thomas Bennett had quietly created an irrevocable trust nearly 25 years earlier, long before Ryan's business troubles had ever begun, long before any hint of family conflict had ever surfaced between them. The trust held not only a substantial cash reserve that had been steadily growing through conservative investments for over 2 decades, but also something else entirely, something Claire never could have anticipated in 100 years. Buried deep within the trust documents was a secondary deed attached to the family home itself. A document establishing a beneficiary protection clause that legally prevented the house from ever being sold, transferred, or mortgaged without Claire's explicit written consent, regardless of whose name might appear on any future deed. Her father, 25 years earlier, had quietly and deliberately protected that house against exactly the kind of betrayal now unfolding. Almost as if some part of him had always sensed his own children might one day turn against each other. Claire could barely speak as Patricia continued explaining, revealing that this meant Ryan's deed transfer, forged or not, had been legally void from the very moment it was signed, because it directly violated the binding terms of an irrevocable trust that predated it by more than 2 full decades. Ryan had never known the trust even existed. Neither had Claire, not really, not with any real specifics. Only her father's cryptic hospital bed promise that she hadn't fully understood until this exact moment. Your father was extremely deliberate about all of this, Mrs. Bennett Hayes, Patricia said gently over the phone. He came in personally to set this up decades ago, and he made it very clear to us, in writing, that this was meant to protect you specifically, in case anyone ever tried to take advantage of your mother later in her life. He used the word anyone in his notes, but reading through his private instructions, I genuinely believe he suspected it might be someone very close to your own family. Claire sat in stunned, tearful silence in the middle of her open office, tears sliding freely down her face as 2 decades of quiet, invisible protection from a father she thought she had fully understood suddenly revealed itself in ways she was only just beginning to comprehend. Armed with this staggering new information, Claire returned to Walter Higgins's office the very next morning, trust documents clutched tightly in hand, and watched as the color visibly drained from his face while he read through the paperwork Patricia had overnighted directly to her home. This changes absolutely everything, Walter said quietly, setting the papers down on his desk. Ryan's transfer isn't just ethically wrong, Claire. It's legally void from the start. And depending on exactly how this forged signature came to appear on that deed, we may be looking at serious criminal fraud, not simply a private family dispute. For the first time since the locks had been changed on her childhood home, Claire felt something other than grief and fear settle over her. She felt the cold, steady clarity of someone who finally had the truth firmly on her side. And truth, she was beginning to understand with total certainty, could be the most powerful weapon of all. Confronting Ryan wasn't something Claire chose to do out of anger, though she certainly had every right in the world to feel it. Instead, she and Walter carefully arranged a formal meeting at the attorney's office, calm and orderly, with Diane present as well, because Claire needed her mother to hear the full truth directly, without Ryan's carefully curated version of events, filtering every single word beforehand. When Ryan walked into that office and saw the folder of trust documents sitting squarely on the table, Claire watched something shift dramatically behind his eyes. A flicker of raw panic, quickly masked by forced, brittle composure. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice noticeably tighter than he probably intended it to sound. "Dad never mentioned any trust like that to me, ever." "That's exactly the point, Ryan," Claire said, keeping her own voice level despite the storm raging inside her chest. "He didn't need to mention it to you. He set it up specifically to protect this family from exactly this kind of situation." Diane, sitting quietly beside her son, slowly unfolded a small piece of paper from her purse, her hands trembling visibly. "Ryan told me you signed that deed transfer together with your father, Claire," she said softly, barely above a whisper. "He told me you were right there in the room, that you had agreed to it before he passed away. Is that actually true?" The room went completely silent. Claire looked at her mother, heartbroken all over again by the sheer depth of the manipulation Ryan had constructed. Layer upon careful layer of lies, designed to turn even their own mother against her own. "I was sitting in the hospital waiting room the entire day that deed was supposedly signed," Claire said gently but with unmistakable firmness in her voice. Dad was in surgery that whole day. He couldn't possibly have signed anything. I have the hospital records to prove every hour of it, and so does Walter. Sitting right here, Diane's face crumpled instantly. Decades of unwavering trust in her son colliding violently with the undeniable truth, now sitting directly in front of her on the table. She turned slowly to Ryan, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharper and colder than Claire had ever once heard from her mother. "Did you forge your father's signature, Ryan? Look at me and tell me the truth." Ryan didn't answer right away, and in that heavy, unbearable silence, everyone in the room found their answer without a single word being spoken. When he finally did speak, his voice cracked with something that sounded almost like desperate relief, the sheer exhaustion of a man who had been carrying an unbearable secret for far too many months. "I was drowning, Mom. The development project failed completely. I owed people money I had absolutely no way of paying back. I thought if I just handled the house quietly, sold it fast, paid everything off before anyone noticed, no one would ever have to know how badly I had messed everything up. I was going to fix it. I swear to you, I was going to fix everything before anyone ever found out the truth." There was no triumphant shouting in that room, no dramatic screaming match between siblings, only the quiet, devastating sound of an entire family confronting the wreckage of one member's desperation. Claire felt no real satisfaction in that moment, only a deep, aching sadness for the brother she used to know so well, the boy who had once protected her from bullies on the school bus. Now, a grown man who had tried to steal the very roof over their mother's head simply to cover up his own catastrophic mistakes. Walter gently explained the legal reality of the situation to everyone present in the room. Because of the trust, the fraudulent deed would be immediately nullified. The house would remain fully protected, exactly as Thomas Bennett had always intended it to be. And while Claire had every legal right to pursue full criminal charges against her own brother for forgery and fraud, that final decision belonged entirely and only to her. Claire spent the following week wrestling privately with what real justice actually meant in a situation as painful as this one. Part of her desperately wanted Ryan to face the full weight of consequences for what he had done, to understand in some tangible, undeniable way that betrayal always carries a real cost. But another part of her, the part that still remembered decades of shared birthdays and holidays and quiet family dinners around the same kitchen table, simply couldn't ignore the raw desperation behind his actions, even though it never once excused them. In the end, Claire made a decision that surprised even herself. She agreed not to pursue criminal charges against Ryan, on the firm condition that he formally relinquish any and all claims to the property, enter into a strict, structured repayment plan to cover the substantial legal fees the family had incurred because of his actions, and begin ongoing family therapy sessions to genuinely address whatever had allowed him to justify such a devastating betrayal in the very first place. It wasn't about letting him off easily. It was about breaking a destructive cycle before it completely destroyed what little was left of their already fragile family, and about honoring the kind of man her father had actually been. Underneath everything, someone who quietly protected the people he loved, even when doing so would have been far easier to avoid. The trust money, sitting patiently untouched for over 2 decades, turned out to be substantial enough that Claire was able to help her mother move into a smaller, far more manageable home nearby, one that Diane herself personally chose, filled with soft natural light and a garden she could finally tend to without needing anyone else's permission. The original family home, the very one Ryan had tried so desperately to steal, was eventually sold with everyone's full and honest agreement, and the proceeds were split fairly between them. Faithfully honoring the balance Thomas Bennett had always quietly intended, even from beyond the grave itself. Claire used part of her own share to finally finish the master's degree she had been slowly working toward for years and turn it into something much larger, launching a small consulting practice that helped other families navigate exactly the kind of estate confusion and elder protection issues that had nearly destroyed her own family completely. She often thought about how strange, almost fated, it was that her father's quiet, unglamorous decision made decades earlier, one careful conversation, one carefully worded trust, One single moment of foresight had ended up saving not just a house, but an entire family's fragile future. Months later, sitting in her mother's bright, sunlit new kitchen, Claire watched Diane laugh warmly at something playing on the television, looking more genuinely like herself than she had in over a full year. Ryan visited every other Sunday now, noticeably quieter, far more careful with his words. Still working steadily through the therapy Claire had firmly insisted on. Still rebuilding trust, one small, honest moment at a time between them. It wasn't a perfect ending by any means, and Claire had learned enough by now in her life to know that real life rarely offers anyone a perfect ending. But it was an honest one, built solidly on truth instead of secrets, and for her family, after everything they had all survived together, that honesty was worth more to her than any house ever could be. Her father had known, somehow, in some quiet corner of his heart, that love alone would never be enough to fully protect the people he cared about most. He had backed that love with real foresight, with quiet preparation made decades in advance, with a trust document written long before anyone could have possibly predicted why it would one day matter so much. And in the end, that was the lesson Claire carried with her every single day going forward. That true protection is rarely loud or dramatic. It is patient, it is deliberate, and sometimes it waits 25 long years for exactly the right moment to save everything that truly matters. If this story moved you even slightly, if it made you think about your own family, your own parents, and the quiet sacrifices they've made that you may never fully know about, drop a comment below right now and tell us honestly what part of the story hit you the hardest. Share this video with someone who genuinely needs to hear that truth always finds its way to the surface eventually, no matter how long it takes to get there. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Legacy Whisper, because next week, we're bringing you another powerful story of betrayal, resilience, and the kind of justice that only time itself can ever truly deliver.